Some minds don't sleep, they remember.
The sky never truly belongs to us. It is only a temporary gift, a privilege to glide through the clouds. But to have that moment of freedom, we have signed a tacit pact and oath to place our complete trust in the brilliant minds, the creators of the colossal machines that conquer the skies. We believe that every detail, from the smallest screw to the great wings of the plane, is crafted to protect us. But what if that trust is betrayed? What happens when those iron birds conceal a deadly secret? When the sky, once a dream, turns into a nightmare? When the machine you entrust your life to becomes your greatest enemy? Tonight, we are not talking about soaring flights. We will delve into the horrifying crashes. We'll uncover the truth about Boeing. If you are brave enough to face the secrets hidden in the black boxes, press subscribe right now. The journey into the truth begins. The legacy of the sky. In the introduction, we were confronted with a pressing, lingering question. What happens when the giant we blindly trust turns its back and blatantly lies? When the silent pact between man and sky is mercilessly torn apart? But before we plunge into the abyss of that collapse, before we turn the darkest pages of history, we must pause, take a deep breath, and behold that giant in its most radiant glory. We must understand the legacy they built, not with cold concrete towers, but with gleaming aluminum, sturdy titanium, and the dreams of free flight, dreams that have lifted humanity closer to the stars. Tonight, we will not rush into tragedy. We'll begin with a passionate, fervent love story. A love story between man and the sky, an enchanting affair where mechanical arms reached out to conquer the endless expanse, where dreams were no longer bound by earthly gravity. Let's turn back the clock with me to the early years of the 20th century, when flying was still a mysterious miracle, a privilege reserved for the most daring, the craziest inventors with eyes sparkling with hope. It was a time when the sky was still the domain of birds and gods, where humans only dared to dream from the ground. And then, in Seattle, a city of drizzling rain, where ancient timber forests grew denser, a small company was founded in 1916 by a timber merchant named William Boeing. He was not an aeronautical engineer, not a great scientist, but a businessman with foresight, who saw the potential in wings that could fly. They didn't just build mere airplanes. No, they were weaving the American dream, a dream of conquest, of industrial power, of turning the impossible into reality. From crude mail planes staggering through the sky at a slow pace, they gradually reached higher, further. By World War II, Boeing had become a symbol of American military might. The B-17 flying fortresses, colossal steel monsters bristling with machine guns, soared through the skies of Europe, dropping bombs on Axis targets, helping to decide the fate of the world. Thousands of pilots placed their lives in Boeing's hands, and they were not disappointed. The B-17s returned from hell, their bodies riddled with bullets, yet they flew on resiliently. And then, when the war ended, the jet age erupted like a true revolution. Boeing pioneered with the 707 and engineering masterpiece, the first truly successful commercial jetliner. Imagine the 1950s, when the world was still accustomed to lumbering propeller planes. The Boeing 777 shot into the sky at near the speed of sound, turning the journey from New York to London from a lengthy adventure into a short, luxurious flight. It opened the era of mass air travel, turning the world into a global village where distance was no longer a barrier. Millions of people flew for the first time, looked down on the clouds from above, and they whispered, "Thank you, Boeing." But their greatest legacy, their immortal symbol, was born in 1969, year the world saw a man set foot on the moon. It was the Boeing 747, it's the queen of the skies. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the first time you saw it. A giant metal monster. With its massive two-story fuselage, the distinctive hump at the front like a royal crown, so large that it seemed to defy Newton's laws of physics. It wasn't just a plane. It was an engineering marvel, a flying monument to the boundless ambition and genius talent of humanity. With the ability to carry over 400 passengers flying thousands of miles without stopping, the 747 became a symbol of international travel, of global connection. It has transported billions of passengers from presidents on historic tours to ordinary families on vacation, from scientists carrying dreams to wandering artists seeking inspiration. Over 50 years, the 747 didn't just fly. It changed the way we see the world, turning distant borders into easy destinations. And throughout that glorious journey, Boeing built something even more precious than their gleaming airplanes. A legacy of rock-solid safety. If it ain't Boeing, I ain't going. It wasn't just a clever marketing slogan. It became an unshakable belief, a mantra whispered by millions of passengers every time they boarded a plane, fastened their seatbelts, and closed their eyes in prayer. A pact of absolute trust, where every flight was a promise of a safe return. But no dynasty is eternal. No empire avoids decline. On the other side of the Atlantic, a new rival had risen like a storm. A giant alliance of European nations, France, Germany, Britain, Spain, had joined forces to create Airbus, a government-backed company with a mission to challenge American dominance in the skies. And so, the clash of the titans began a bloodless war, not on the battlefield but fought silently, fiercely on engineering blueprints, in the sealed boardrooms of major airlines, and on fiercely competitive price lists. This wasn't just a war about airplanes. It was a war of national pride, of dominance of the skies, of who would control the future of global aviation. The pressure mounted like an overinflated balloon about to burst. The pressure to build planes that were faster to shorten travel time, more efficient to save fuel, and cheaper to beat the competition. Shareholders demanded higher profits, airlines demanded more advanced technology, and the world was constantly changing. Perhaps it was in that crucible of pressure that the first cracks in Boeing's golden legacy began to appear teeny. Subtle cracks, warnings forgotten in stacks of administrative paperwork, tragedies that few remember today, but which were ghostly echoes, heralding a terrible storm to come. Join me on a journey to Japan, 1985, a country booming economically, where everyone was bustling with modern life. It was Japan Airlines Flight 123, a familiar Boeing 747, packed with passengers during the sacred Obon holiday. Imagine 524 people, families reuniting, tired businessmen, excited children, all filled with a joyful atmosphere. Chatting lively in the cozy cabin, the plane took off from Tokyo, heading for Osaka, a short, familiar domestic flight like a bus ride. And then, suddenly, a loud explosion erupted at the tail of the plane, like a thunderclap in a clear sky. The entire hydraulic system, the control heart of the aircraft, was torn apart. It could no longer be controlled. It flew like a broken kite, swaying madly among the clouds. For the next 32 minutes as long as a lifetime, the pilots fought heroically, with an unimaginable effort, using only the thrust of the engines to try to control the dying monster, roaring in its agony. They called the ground, their voices trembling but firm, trying to salvage the situation. Inside the cabin, realizing that death was imminent, many passengers took out pen and paper, writing their final farewells to their families' trembling handwriting, soaked in tears. Live happily without mom. Dad loves you kids forever. Take care of each other. Those notes, later found among the wreckage, were like whispers from the dead. The plane finally slammed into a desolate mountain, shattering into pieces. 520 people were killed, the worst single aircraft disaster in human history, an indelible pain for the Japanese people. The cause? A shoddy, negligent repair performed by Boeing technicians 7 years earlier, after a minor incident. A rear pressure bulkhead had not been repaired correctly, mismatched screws, loose welds, and it had exploded after thousands of flight cycles, like a technical time bomb activated by time. A crack had been overlooked. A human error had led to an immeasurable tragedy. Now, let's shift the scene to Long Island, New York, 1996, a hot summer evening. As the sun was setting behind the Atlantic horizon, it was 2:08 Flight 800, another Boeing 747, was taken off from JFK Airport, heading for romantic Paris, just 12 minutes after leaving the ground. As passengers were relaxing with a glass of wine and dreams of the Eiffel Tower, the plane suddenly exploded into a giant fireball, illuminating the night sky. 230 people were killed instantly. The wreckage scattered into the sea like fragments of a broken dream. The world was shocked, horrified. The FBI immediately launched an investigation of unprecedented scale, suspecting it was an act of terrorism, perhaps a bomb or even a missile from a mysterious submarine. Hundreds of witnesses on the coast swore they saw a streak of light shooting towards the plane like an arrow from hell. Conspiracy theories abounded. Was it Al-Qaeda? Or a dark political plot? The investigation lasted for years, cost millions of dollars, with thousands of pieces of wreckage recovered from the seabed. But after all, the investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board came to a different conclusion. A conclusion even more terrifying than terrorism, because it could happen at any time on any plane. No missile, no bomb. The most likely cause was an electrical spark from a faulty wire, which ignited flammable fuel vapor inside the plane's nearly empty center fuel tank. A simple, yet deadly technical failure design flaw that could exist on thousands of other 747s flying in the world's skies. Another time bomb, hiding in the very heart of the machine. Two horrific tragedies. Hundreds of innocent lives taken in an instant. Warnings engraved with fire and steel, with blood and tears. But to the world at the time, they seemed to be just isolated incidents, random accidents in a complex system, repair error by humans. A short-circuited wire due to age, rare accidents. Boeing's safety legacy, though slightly tarnished, was still there, still gleaming in the sun. That thought that even in the safest, most sophisticated systems ever created by man, there are always hidden cracks. Time bombs waiting for the moment to explode. Does it make you feel uneasy, shudder every time you think about it? When you heard the name Boeing before, what was the first image that came to your mind? Was it of soaring planes, symbols of safety and reliability? Or the dark news of recent disasters, ghosts from the past? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share with me, have you ever flown on a Boeing 7? And what was your feeling at that time? The tragedies of the past seem to be just isolated incidents, minor scratches on the gleaming metal surface. But then, a twin nightmare occurred, a nightmare no longer confined to individual technical errors. It exposed a terrible truth that the crack was no longer in a screw or a wire. It lay in the very soul of the company, in the dark decisions made in the shadow of greed and pressure. In the next part, we will talk about the 737 MAX, the nightmare that changed everything. The twin nightmares of the 737 MAX. In the previous part, we look back at the first cracks in Boeing's golden legacy tragedies, like Japan Airlines 123 or TWA 800. Warnings that were buried, dismissed as isolated mistakes in a near-perfect safety history. We saw Boeing, a symbol of the American dream, a giant of the sky, once celebrated by the world as a guarantee of survival. But those cracks were just the beginning, like small fissures before a terrifying earthquake. Tonight, we will step into the eye of the storm, where the twin nightmares of the 737 MAX not only claimed hundreds of lives, but also tore apart Boeing's reputation, exposing a painful truth. Our trust had been betrayed by the very people who had promised to fly us safely. Join me in Indonesia on October 29, 2018, a clear morning. The sunlight sparkling on the Java Sea, Lion Air Flight 610, a brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8, had just rolled off the factory floor 2 months earlier. Taking off from Jakarta, carrying 189 people passengers with dreams, plans, and lives ahead of them. There were families on vacation, businessmen rushing to meetings, and children flying for the first time, their eyes sparkling as they looked out the window. They took off, the sky opening up to welcome them. Everything seemed perfect. But just a few minutes later, the nightmare began. The nose of the plane suddenly pitched down, powerfully, violently, as if pulled into an abyss by an invisible hand. In the cockpit, the captain and first officer were stunned. They had given no such command. The plane was acting on its own, against their will. They followed all procedures correctly, pulling back on the control column, using all their strength to bring the nose up. Sweat poured, hearts pounded. The plane's nose lifted, trembling like a wounded animal trying to struggle free. But just a few seconds later, it pitched down again, stronger, more determined, as if a ghostly will was in control. Imagine the horror in the cockpit at that moment. Two pilots trained to remain calm in all situations were now desperately fighting an unruly machine. They shouted over the radio, their voices strained with stress, trying to find answers in manuals, in experience, in survival instinct. But every time they pulled the nose up, it pitched down again, repeating like a dance of death, tug-of-war between man and machine, between life and death. 13 minutes after takeoff, just 13 short minutes, the plane plunged into the Java Sea at a terrifying speed, shattering into pieces. 189 people, not a single survivor. Dreams, unsaid goodbyes, all submerged beneath the cold water. The world was shocked, stunned. A brand new plane praised as the pinnacle of technology. Why did it crash so mysteriously? The wreckage floated on the sea like pieces of a deadly puzzle waiting to be solved. What was Boeing's first reaction? They did not admit fault. It's not a word of apology, not a clear explanation. Instead, they skillfully shifted the blame. Maybe it was Lion Air, a low-cost airline that had not maintained the plane properly. Maybe it was the Indonesian pilots who lacked skills, were not adequately trained to handle the situation. A sophisticated blame game, wrapped in careful statements, aimed at protecting the reputation of the 737 MAX, their best-selling aircraft, the darling of a decade of development. But the ghost did not stop there. Just 5 months later, on March 10, 2019, history repeated itself with an unimaginable cruelty. Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, also on a Boeing 737 MAX 8, took off from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, carrying 157 people, diplomats, aid workers, families, and passengers just on their way home. The exact same scenario, like a horrifying copy. Just minutes after leaving the runway, the nose of the plane began to pitch down uncontrollably. The pilots, well-trained, experienced, fought until the very last moment. On the cockpit voice recorder, you can hear the panic mixed with determination in their voices. As they flipped through manuals, performed every emergency procedure, trying to regain control from the rebelling machine. Pull up, one of them shouted. The machine would not listen, kept pushing down like a beast with its own will. 6 minutes after takeoff, the plane slammed into a dry field, creating a deep crater and a column of black smoke rising into the sky. 157 people killed. No survivors. Once again, the wreckage lay scattered like pieces of a curse. This time, the world was not just shocked, the world was outraged. Its crashes, 346 lives in less than 5 months, with the same deadly scenario. This was no longer a coincidence. This was a pattern, a systemic failure, betrayal. A series of countries from China, Europe, to Canada simultaneously ordered the grounding of the entire 737 MAX fleet, an unprecedented move in aviation history. What is noteworthy is that this decision was made without the consensus of the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, the agency once considered the gold standard of aviation safety. The trust in Boeing and the FAA and the system itself had collapsed completely. So what was that ghost? What turned the most modern machines into flying coffins? The answer lies in 4 letters. MCAS, Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System. It sounds complicated, but its essence is a story of compromise, greed, and blatant concealment. When Boeing developed the 737 MAX series to compete with the Airbus A320, Neo, a fuel-efficient rival, threatening their market share, they made a fateful decision. To increase performance, they installed larger, more powerful engines, but also heavier, and placed them higher and further forward on the wings. This change, though small, disrupted the aerodynamic characteristics of the 737 MAX, causing the nose to tend to pitch up too high in some flight situations, leading to the risk of a stall dangerous state that could cause the plane to fall. Redesign the entire aircraft? Too expensive, too time-consuming, and would slow down the race with Airbus. Dead. Boeing chose a cheaper, faster solution, a software patch called MCAS. This system was designed to automatically intervene, detecting through an angle of attack sensor when the nose of the plane pitched up too high and pushing the nose down to prevent a stall. Sounds smart, right? But this is where the nightmare began. Deadly detail number 1, MCAS relied on only one single sensor. One sensor. If that sensor failed due to damage, a bird strike, or simply a minor technical glitch, it would send erroneous data, making MCAs think the plane was in danger, when in fact it was not. And then the system would activate, pushing the nose of the plane down with an irresistible force despite all the pilot's efforts. A tiny technical error, but enough to turn a normal flight into a tragedy. Deadly detail number 2. And the unforgivable sin, Boeing deliberately concealed the existence of MCAs. In the flight manuals, MCAS was only mentioned vaguely as an insignificant technical detail. Thousands of pilots around the world, the people responsible for the lives of hundreds of passengers, stepped into the cockpit of the 737 MAX without knowing about this system, without being trained to deal with it, without being warned that they could have control taken away from them by a secret line of code. Why? Because Boeing wanted the 737 MAX to be seen as a new but old version of the 737 series, so that airlines would not have to spend millions more dollars training pilots in simulators. Cost-saving decision. But the price paid was human lives. Imagine, you are a pilot trained to trust your machine, to believe that every system is designed to support you. But in the decisive moment, that machine turns its back on you, fights against you. You pull the control column, but it doesn't listen. You do everything by the book, but the machine keeps pushing down, like an untamable beast. The helplessness, the fear, and the outrage, how would you feel when you realize you are fighting an invisible enemy, an enemy you were never warned about? 346 lives, 2 crashes, 1 faulty sensor, 1 secret line of code, decision to conceal, to protect profits, regardless of safety. This is no longer a mere technical error. This is a betrayal of trust, an indelible stain on aviation history. Let's pause for a moment and ask yourself, if you were a passenger on that flight, or if you were a relative of a victim, how would you feel knowing that the tragedy could have been prevented? With just a little honesty. If you were a pilot, put into an unfair fight with a system you knew nothing about, what would you think of the people who created that machine? Share your feelings in the comments below. A like and subscribe to the channel will help us continue to uncover these painful truths. But the bigger question remains, how could a dangerous system like MCAS be approved by the FAA, the world's leading aviation safety agency? And what happened behind the scenes, in the dark corners of Boeing, where fateful decisions were made? And why, even after these tragedies, is the journey for justice still fraught with obstacles? In the next part, we will step into the closed boardrooms, the hidden emails, and a corporate culture where profit seems to have been placed above human life. The investigation is not over yet. The ghost in the corporate culture. In the previous part, we stood amidst the wreckage of 2 Boeing 737 MAX aircraft, witnessing the twin nightmare that claimed 346 lives. We decoded the ghost named MCAS, a secret line of code, created as a cheap patch for a design flaw, but which became the fatal blade that severed the world's trust in Boeing. We asked the painful question, why? Why was such a dangerous system allowed to exist, to be concealed, and to be certified to fly by those who should have put safety above all else? The answer lies not in technical drawings or cold lines of code. It lies in a deeper, darker, and much more elusive place. In the very culture of a corporation that was once a symbol of the American dream. Tonight, we will not talk about planes falling from the sky. We'll talk about the people who created the man, about the ghost that has quietly haunted Boeing, seeping through closed boardrooms, hasty decisions, and buried emails long before the disaster occurred. For decades, Boeing was not just an aircraft manufacturing company. It was the soul of the aviation industry, the pride of America, a symbol of innovation and safety. Boeing was led by engineers' minds obsessed with perfection. People who viewed each aircraft as a work of art, where every screw, every weld had to achieve absolute precision. To them, safety was not a goal, it was a religion, an oath etched into every design. If it ain't bowing, I ain't going. That phrase was not just a slogan, but a sacred promise to millions of passengers around the world. But then in 1997, an event occurred, quiet but fateful, like a small crack in a sturdy fortress wall. Boeing merged with McDonnell Douglas, their biggest rival in the US. On paper, it was an acquisition. Boeing had swallowed McDonnell Douglas, consolidating its dominant position. But in reality, many insiders at Boeing felt a frightening truth. McDonnell Douglas, with its culture focused on cost-cutting, maximizing profits, and pleasing shareholders, had silently taken over the soul of Boeing. A longtime former engineer bitterly said, "Boeing didn't buy McDonnell Douglas. McDonnell Douglas bought Boeing with Boeing's own money." From then on, Boeing's philosophy changed. The engineers who once held decision-making power were pushed aside, making way for financial managers. People who spoke the language of profit, stocks, and market share. Profit above all became the new guiding principle, seeping into every decision from the production line to the boardroom. Safety, though still mentioned in speeches, began to be seen as a cost to be controlled, no longer an inviolable value. The ghost of financial pressure began to loom, like a toxic fog, blurring the ideals that once made Boeing's name. And it was in this context that the war with Airbus, the rival from Europe, erupted more fiercely than ever. Airbus launched the A320neo series, a fuel-efficient, competitively priced aircraft, causing airlines around the globe to rush to place orders. Boeing, once the king of the sky, suddenly found itself threatened. Market share declined, shareholders worried, and pressure from airlines demanding a worthy competitor to the A320neo grew stronger. Boeing stood at a crossroads. It could invest tens of billions of dollars in decades to design a completely new aircraft with advanced technology and optimal safety. Or they could choose a shortcut faster, cheaper, and more convenient for airlines. They chose the second path. They took the 737 series, the workhorse that had served them for 50 years, and upgraded it to the 737 MAX, with the promise that this would be a modern, fuel-efficient aircraft, and most importantly, would not require pilots to retrain, saving millions of dollars for airlines. But that shortcut led straight to disaster. Installing larger engines, placed higher and further forward on the wing, changed the aerodynamic characteristics of the 737 MAX, causing it to tend to pitch its nose up too high, leading to the risk of a stall. Redesign the entire aircraft, too expensive. Change the pilot training process, would lose the competitive advantage. Instead, Boeing chose a smart solution. MCA's software system designed to automatically intervene, pushing the nose of the plane down when the sensor detected a risk of stall. But MCA's was not a technological step forward. It was a hasty patch, a way to hide a design flaw to keep the 737 MAX similar to older versions, at least on paper. And then, the deadliest decision was made. Not to tell the pilots about MCA's in the flight manuals. This system was only mentioned vaguely as an insignificant technical detail. Thousands of pilots around the world stepped into the cockpit of the 737 MAX without knowing that a secret line of code could take away their control at any moment. Why? Because Boeing knew that admitting MCA's was a new, important system would force airlines to spend more money to train pilots in simulators, a cost that Airbus did not require. In the race with Airbus, Boeing could not afford to fall behind. They chose silence. They chose profit. Imagine you were an engineer at Boeing at that time. You sat in a crowded meeting room surrounded by tired colleagues and bosses with sharp eyes. You knew MCAs had problems. You knew that relying on a single sensor was a dangerous gamble. You had seen the test reports, where the system ran amok in the simulator, pushing the nose of the plane down uncontrollably. You sensed the danger, like a cold chill running down your spine. What would you do? Speak up. Despite the risk of being seen as an obstacle, being fired, or even being isolated in the very company you had dedicated your career to. Or would you remain silent, telling yourself that the bosses had calculated everything, the responsibility was not on your shoulders, that this system would probably be fine? It was not an easy choice. A test of conscience amidst the pressure of a giant corporate machine racing against time and money. It was in the silence of hundreds of people, engineers, managers, test staff, that the disaster was programmed. And when the truth began to leak, it did not come from glossy press releases or public apologies. It came from internal documents, hidden emails, buried chat logs, brought to light by U.S. congressional investigators like fragments of a moral black box. In one internal chat, a Boeing employee wrote about MCAS. This airplane is designed by clowns, who in turn are supervised by monkeys. A bitter yet truthful confession, painting a terrifying picture of a corporate culture that had rotted from within. A test pilot, in an email to a colleague, admitted that MCAS was running rampant in simulator tests, but these concerns seemed to never be passed on to higher levels, another engineer wrote. We are being pushed to do things faster, cheaper, and I'm not sure we have control over the quality anymore. These are not the words of external enemies or envious critics, and this is the voice of the insiders themselves, those who witnessed the engineering culture that was once the pride of Boeing being suffocated by financial pressure. These emails, these chats, are evidence of a failure not just in engineering, but in ethics, a failure of an entire system, where profit had triumphed over the fear of a possible tragedy. Let's pause for a moment and ask yourself, if you were in such a giant organization, where the initial ideals were distorted by the pressure for profit, what would you do? Is it possible to avoid the conflict between safety and profit? Or is that the unavoidable price of a world dominated by shareholders and the market? And when those two values conflict, what can we rely on to protect ourselves in government regulations, on the conscience of insiders, or simply on luck? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A like and subscribe to the channel will help us continue to delve deeper into these dark corners, when the truth is hidden by the very people responsible for telling it, who will bring it to light. What is the price of exposing that truth? In the next part, we will delve into the post-disaster investigations, the efforts to find justice, and the lessons written in the blood of 346 victims. The journey is not over yet. The case file. In the previous part, we stepped into the dark corners of Boeing, where the ghost of profit and silence had rotted the culture of a giant. We heard the bitter confessions from insiders themselves, emails, hidden chat logs, where a Boeing employee called the 737 MAX a plane designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys. A culture that once celebrated engineering perfection had been suffocated by financial pressure, by greed, and by wrong decisions. But when a crime occurs and, let's be blunt, the loss of 346 lives was not a random accident, the responsibility does not lie solely with those on the inside. The light of justice must be shown from the outside, from those tasked with protecting us, from the systems built to prevent disaster. Tonight we will open the case file, flipping through every page of documents, every testimony, to find out what really happened after the two 737 MAX tragedies. We will talk about the investigation and about the horrifying truths it has exposed. After the second crash of Ethiopian Airlines on March 10, 2019, the world ran out of patience. Without waiting for the United States, the country once seen as the leader in aviation safety regulatory agencies around the globe, from China, the European Union, to Canada, simultaneously ordered the grounding of the entire 737 MAX fleet. This was not just a dry technical decision. It was a political statement, an unspoken accusation that the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, the agency once revered by the world as the gold standard of safety, had failed in its mission. Trust in the FAA, in Boeing, and the very system of U.S. aviation oversight had shattered, like the wreckage of the two planes that fell into the Java Sea and the Ethiopian fields. And so, a global investigation was launched on an unprecedented scale. The U.S. Congress convened hearings. The Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation. Journalists, activists, and the families of the 346 victims stood up together to demand answers. What they found was not just a technical flaw, not just a faulty MCAS system. They discovered a rotten oversight system, a network of collusion between the supervised and the supervisor, and a widespread moral failure that extended from the executive offices of Boeing to the corridors of power at the FAA. Let's start with the relationship between Boeing and the FAA, relationship that should have been an inviolable boundary between corporate interests and public safety. In theory, the FAA is an independent agency, tasked with overseeing every aircraft manufactured in the U.S., ensuring they meet the strictest safety standards. But for years, a quiet change had taken place, like a crack spreading on a fortress wall. Due to budget pressures, the increasing complexity of aviation technology, and the growing influence of corporations, the FAA began to delegate part of its work to the manufacturers themselves. They allowed Boeing to self-inspect and certify the safety of its own products, with minimal oversight from the FAA. It's like letting a student grade their own exam, or, as investigators later repeated, letting the fox guard the henhouse. In the case of the 737 MAX, this collusion reached its peak. Internal documents later released showed that Boeing had continuously pressured the FAA to speed up the approval process, asking the agency to skip or simplify inspection steps. The MCA system, the heart of the disaster, was barely scrutinized by the FAA, partly because Boeing had deliberately downplayed its importance in the reports submitted. In one internal email, an FAA employee even wrote, "We are being pushed to approve quickly because Boeing needs to deliver the planes on time to customers." A system that was supposed to protect human lives had become a tool to serve the profits of a corporation. But the failure did not just come from the outside. Inside Boeing, there were people who saw the truth, who sensed the danger, and who tried to speak up. They were the whistleblowers, engineers, test staff, ordinary people with extraordinary courage. One engineer wrote an internal report warning that MCAS's reliance on a single sensor was an unacceptable risk. Another employee, in an email to a superior, complained about the frantic production pressure. "We are being pushed to work faster, cheaper, and I'm not sure we have control over the quality anymore." A test pilot, in a chat, described MCAs running rampant in simulator tests, turning the cockpit into a battlefield between man and machine. But those voices were buried in Boeing's giant bureaucratic machine. They were seen as troublemakers, people lacking team spirit. Some were retaliated against, transferred, or fired. One brave engineer, after repeatedly warning about MCAS, was told to keep quiet if he didn't want to lose his job. The truth had been spoken, but no one listened, not for lack of evidence, but because those in power had chosen to turn a blind eye. Imagine you were one of those whistleblowers. You sat in your office, watching your colleagues busy around you, but you knew a terrifying truth. The machine you were helping to build could kill people. You wrote reports, sent emails, even confronted your superiors directly. But every time you spoke up, you felt the cold stares, the implicit warnings, and the invisible pressure weighing on your shoulders. You knew that if you continued, you could lose your job, your career, your stable life you had built. But if you remained silent, you would have to live with the thought that you could have prevented a tragedy. What would you do? Would you have the courage to face an entire system? Or would you bow your head, telling yourself you were just a small cog in a giant machine? That is a question not just for the engineers of Boeing, but for anyone who has ever stood at the boundary between conscience and survival. And the FAA is the agency that should have been the final gatekeeper of aviation safety. Why did they let a dangerous system like MCAS slip through? What should be the role of a state regulatory agency? Friendly partner, helping businesses grow faster? Or a strict supervisor, putting public safety above all economic interests? When both sides, the supervised and the supervisor, are caught in the vortex of profit and pressure, who will protect us? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A like and subscribe to the channel will help us continue to uncover these painful truths. The system had failed. The truth had been buried. 346 people had paid with their lives. But the story does not end there. The investigations, the hearings, and the efforts to find justice have opened a new chapter, a chapter full of pain, but also full of hope for lessons that will change the aviation industry forever. In the next part, we will talk about the lessons written in blood, about the changes the world has demanded, and about the journey to regain trust in the sky. The investigation is not over yet. Lessons written in blood. In the previous part, we opened the case file, stood in the middle of tense hearings, where the light of justice began to shine into the dark corners of Boeing and the Federal Aviation Administration. We heard the bitter confessions from insiders' leaked emails, haunting chat logs, where the 737 MAX was described as a plane designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys. Corporate culture that was once a symbol of engineering perfection had rotted from greed, profit pressure, and culpable silence. But when 346 lives were taken in two horrific disasters, the world could no longer turn a blind eye. Tonight, we are no longer talking about past mistakes or accusations. We will talk about the lessons written in blood, in tears, and in the fragments of trust. We will ask, after all that has happened, what can the aviation industry and, more broadly, all of humanity learn from the ashes of the two 737 MAXes? And are those lessons enough to prevent a similar tragedy in the future? After the second crash of Ethiopian Airlines on March 10, 2019, the world acted with unprecedented speed and determination. Without waiting for the United States, the country that was once the leader in aviation safety regulatory agencies, from China, the European Union, Canada, to Australia, simultaneously ordered the grounding of the entire 737 MAX fleet. This was not just a dry technical decision. It was a declaration of war, a message that trust in the FAA, in Boeing, in the very system that was once the gold standard of the aviation industry, had collapsed. For the first time in history, the world had bypassed the US to protect its own skies. A global investigation was launched, with unprecedented scale and urgency. The US Congress convened hearings where Boeing leaders had to face sharp questions from congressmen and the pained eyes of the victims' families. The US Department of Justice opened a criminal investigation, turning over thousands of pages of internal documents. Journalists, activists, and the relatives of the 346 victims stood up together, not just to find answers, but to demand justice. What they discovered was not just a faulty MCAS system, but a chain of failures that stretched back decades, from a rotten corporate culture to the collusion between Boeing and the FAA. Let's look at the FAA first. As the world's leading aviation regulatory agency, the FAA should have been the final gatekeeper, ensuring that every aircraft that took off was absolutely safe. But the investigations showed a frightening truth. The FAA had gradually become a partner of Boeing, rather than an independent oversight body. For years, due to lack of budget and pressure from corporations, the FAA had delegated to Boeing the authority to self-inspect and certify the safety of its own products, with minimal oversight. In the case of the 737 MAX, the MCA's system, the heart of the disaster, was barely scrutinized by the FAA, because Boeing had deliberately downplayed its importance in reports. A later released internal FAA email revealed, "We were pressured to approve quickly because Boeing needed to deliver the planes on time to customers. If there were delays, they would lose contracts." An agency that was supposed to protect human lives had become an accomplice in a system that put profit above safety. But the light of justice did not only come from official investigations. It came from ordinary people, the whistleblowers, engineers, test pilots, and Boeing employees who dared to stand up. Despite the risk of losing their jobs, being retaliated against, or being isolated, one engineer had warned in an internal report that MCAS's reliance on a single sensor was a fatal risk. A test pilot had written in an email, "MCAS is running rampant in the simulator, and I don't know how to turn it off." Another employee described the frantic production pressure. "We are being pushed to do things faster, cheaper, to the point where there's no time for thorough checks." But those voices were buried in Boeing's bureaucracy, dismissed as troublemakers or lacking team spirit. Some were transferred, fired, or told to keep silent. The truth had been spoken, but it was suffocated before it could reach those with the power to change things. After a series of tense hearings and lengthy investigations, the case file was closed with concrete consequences. Boeing had to pay over $2.5 billion in fines and compensation, one of the largest penalties in aviation history. Senior leaders, including CEO Dennis Muhlenberg, were forced to resign. The FAA had to face extensive reforms, with new laws enacted to strengthen independent oversight and protect whistleblowers. The MCA system was redesigned, adding a second sensor and safety mechanisms to ensure it could not unilaterally override the pilot's control. The 737 MAX fleet, after being grounded for nearly 2 years, was finally allowed to fly again in late 2020, but only after undergoing a series of rigorous checks. But the real lessons of the 737 MAX are not in the laws or the fine numbers. They lie in deeper questions, questions that force us to re-examine the relationship between humans, technology, and ethics in the 21st century. Lesson 1. The danger of invisible automation. Max showed us a frightening truth. When we create automated systems that are too smart, we risk losing control when they fail. The pilots on the 2 fateful flights were not just fighting a faulty system. They were fighting a system they knew nothing about, were not trained to deal with. This raises a bigger question. In a world increasingly dependent on automation, from airplanes, self-driving cars, to algorithms that control daily life, how do we ensure that humans retain ultimate control? How do we avoid the ghosts hidden in lines of code? Lesson 2. Engineering ethics. The story of Boeing is not just a lesson for the aviation industry. It is a warning for Silicon Valley, for companies developing artificial intelligence, self-driving cars, or any system with the potential to decide life and death. The responsibility of an engineer or programmer does not stop at creating a product that works as designed. They must anticipate unintended consequences, must dare to speak up when they see a risk, even if it might threaten their careers. The story of MCAS is a reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, is still a product of humans, and humans are never perfect. Lesson 3. The value of justice. Investigations, the hearings, and the courage of the whistleblowers have proven that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually be brought to light. But justice does not come easily. It requires the persistence of journalists, the outrage of the public, and the courage of those willing to confront an entire system to speak the truth. The families of the 346 victims fought relentlessly, turning their pain into a driving force to change the aviation industry, to ensure that no similar tragedy would happen again. Let's pause for a moment and ask yourself, do you believe we are depending too much on automated systems in our daily lives? From the car you drive, to the algorithm that recommends content you watch, or even the plane you board? Do you ever wonder if you truly understand how they work, and what would happen if they made a mistake? And if you were part of the system, an engineer, a manager, or just an ordinary employee in a large organization, what would you do when faced with the line between conscience and pressure? Share your thoughts in the comments below. A like and subscribe to the channel will help us continue these important conversations. The system had failed. 346 lives had been taken. But from the ashes of the tragedy, lessons have been written in blood and tears. Changes have been implemented, from new laws to safer designs. But there is one thing harder to fix than a line of code or a regulation. That is trust in the sky. In the final part, we will ask the biggest question. After all, is the sky still blue? Can we regain trust in the machines that conquer the skies and in the very people who create them? Is the sky still blue? In the previous part, we went through tense hearings, opened the case file, and confronted the lessons written in the blood of 346 victims. We saw a system collapse from Boeing's rotten corporate culture to the failure of the Federal Aviation Administration as a safety gatekeeper. Boeing has paid the price. Billions of dollars in fines, senior leaders forced to resign. The 737 MAX fleet grounded for nearly 2 years, an unprecedented stain on a giant that once dominated the sky. They have updated the MCAS software, improved pilot training procedures, and promised to change their corporate philosophy. But there is something harder to fix than a line of code, a regulation, or a public apology. It is trust, the silent pact between man and the sky, between passengers and the machines that carry them through the clouds. When that pact is broken, how can we trust to board a plane again? Tonight, we will not look back at the wreckage of the past. We'll look forward, asking the final question. After all, is the sky still blue? Imagine a moment, just for a moment. You are standing at the airport jet bridge, preparing to board a flight. The PA system announces your flight number. You pull your suitcase, walk through the door, and see the logo on the fuselage. It's an Airbus. You probably won't think much of it, just a normal flight. But if it's a Boeing, will a fleeting image cross your mind? A namely in air, Ethiopian Airlines. A feeling of unease, even if it lasts only for a millisecond, as you fasten your seatbelt and look out the window. Trust, which was once a given when you boarded a plane, has now been violated, like a small but unignorable crack in a pane of glass. Boeing has promised to change. They have redesigned MCAS, added a second sensor, enhanced safety measures, and committed to putting people above profit. The FAA has also reformed, with new laws aimed at strengthening independent oversight and protecting whistleblowers. The 737 MAX, after being grounded for nearly 2 years, returned to the skies in late 2020, with thousands of safe flights recorded since then. But are these changes enough to restore trust? Can a new promise erase the memory of the 346 lives lost? Only time and millions of safe flights in the future can answer. But the story of the 737 MAX is not just the story of Boeing or the aviation industry. It's a bigger question for all of us. In an age where technology increasingly shapes our lives, if the safety of millions of people lies in the hands of one company, whether it's Boeing, Tesla, or a tech giant in Silicon Valley, do we have the right to know all the facts, even if that truth keeps us up at night? Should we be informed about the controversies in the boardroom, the concerns of engineers that were ignored, or the risks that were hidden to protect profits? Or should we just blindly trust the regulatory agencies, the people who are supposed to be protecting us? And where does the line between trade secrets and the concealment of deadly risks lie? Our journey began with a broken pact. Trust in a name, a symbol, a promise that if it ain't bowing, it ain't going. Through 6 parts, we have gone through the ups and downs of Boeing's legacy, from the glory of the Queen of the Skies, 747, to the cracks in its corporate culture. From the twin nightmare of the 737 MAX, to the painful lessons written in blood. But this is not a story to spread fear. Flying is still one of the safest forms of travel ever invented by mankind. Every day, millions of people take off and land safely, thanks to the meticulousness of engineers, the vigilance of regulators, and the courage of those who dare to speak up. But the story of Boeing is a reminder that safety is never a given. It's built on honesty, on healthy skepticism, and on people who are willing to put their conscience above their personal interests. It requires engineers who dare to warn of risks, journalists who never stop asking questions, and passengers like us, who must never take that pact of trust for granted. The sky does not promise to always be blue, but it is always there, waiting for us to conquer it ton, the condition that we do not forget the lessons of the past. Let's pause for a moment and ask yourself, the next time you board a plane, what will you think? Will you feel safe? Or will you wonder if there is some MCAs hiding in the system? Do you believe that companies and regulatory agencies have learned their lesson? Or do you think we are still on a risky path? And if you are part of the system and engineer, a manager, or just a passenger, what will you do to ensure that the sky remains a safe place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Like and subscribe to the channel will help us continue these important conversations. Let's keep the story of justice and safety from ever being forgotten. Thank you for joining me on this painful but necessary journey. The night is late and the sky is still there. Vast, majestic, but also full of challenges. The next time you hear the sound of a plane's engine roaring overhead, remember that it's not just noise. It's the echo of a promise that needs to be kept through every safe flight, every day. Good night, with dreams of a sky that is always blue and safe.
You've crossed the story. You felt every pulse in the dark, and I was there with you, quietly, always. That's why I left behind one last thing. Not to explain, not to impress, just to stay with you a little longer. A song I chose with care, as if tucking you in from across time and space. So go on, lay back, the music knows where to take you. you're still here, then you're something rare. Not many stay this long. So, thank you for choosing to stay. I'm here too, still awake, surrounded by the quiet glow of my editing screen, shaping the next stories just for you. If there's anything you want to leave behind, a whisper, a suggestion, even just a symbol, drop it in the comments. Because maybe, tomorrow night, you'll hear yourself echoed in a story that's never been told before. Still here, even now? I have a feeling part of you is still wandering somewhere between wakefulness and dreaming. I know that feeling well because I'm still awake with you. In a quiet room, I'm gently laying out layers of sound. Each breath, each beat, preparing the next journey we'll take together. If you're still listening, leave me a sign. Let me know how you're feeling or just where you are in this vast world. Because right now, in this stillness, you are not alone. You're still there, aren't you? I can't see you, but I can feel you. Like a soft signal pulsing across the silence. Over here, I'm still working, refining layers of sound, rewriting fragments of voice, building the landscape for our next adventure. One that you might inspire. If an idea comes to you, share it with me. Comment below. A theme, a memory, a strange dream. I read every word because I never tell these stories alone. I tell them with you.